Hi friends, this is F Recap. Today I'm going to tell you the story of Big George Foreman. George Foreman grew up in poverty. His family had no money for food or clothes. He often wore old hand-me-downs, which made him the target of bullying. But George could stand up for himself, and he used his fists to do it. At his new school, the same thing happened again. Kids mocked him for not bringing lunch, and George beat up the bully. As he got older, his love for fighting didn't go away. He couldn't imagine life without it, which often got him in trouble. With no money, George turned to robbing people on the streets. One day, he and a friend jumped a drunk man in an alley, but the man turned out to be a cop. When they saw the badge, they ran. A patrol car chased them, and George ended up hiding under a house in a pool of sewage. To avoid being found by a police dog, he covered himself from head to toe in filth coming from a sewer pipe. Later that day, George saw a TV ad for a government program offering training to young men without education or jobs. After talking to his mom, he decided to sign up and left his hometown behind. At the dorm, George met Desmond, a guy who liked to party and be lazy. George didn't like him at first, but eventually they became friends. When his mom packed his things, she had put in a brand new pair of sneakers. One day, someone stole those sneakers. George and Desmond were sitting in the cafeteria when the thief walked in. George chased him down, punched through the door of his room, and almost threw the guy out the window, but was stopped by Doc Broadus. Doc was about to kick George out of the program for fighting again, but changed his mind at the last second. He was a former boxer who now trained young talent. He saw potential in George and invited him to the gym. On his first day, George was put in the ring with an experienced boxer and lost badly. Everyone laughed at him. Angry, George punched a heavy bag so hard it fell to the floor. Doc had a talk with him and convinced George to start training seriously. He told him that with a punch like that, he could go far in boxing. George began to dream of the life pro boxers had: fame, money, and respect. A year later, George competed in the Olympics and won the gold medal by defeating a Soviet boxer. But when he returned home, he was met with criticism. Some people in his community saw him as a sellout for representing a country that didn't care about them. Still, George chose to keep going and build a boxing career. At a train station, he met a woman named Paula. They started calling each other, then dating, and eventually got married. Around the same time, Doc brought George to a gym for future champions. George now had a new team of coaches. In 1973, George was set to fight Joe Frazier. He won, and overnight became a superstar. Everyone saw him as the future of boxing, and George wanted to enjoy it all. At a party, he met an attractive woman and cheated on Paula. He also put his friend Desmond in charge of his finances, but only if Desmond stopped drinking. Desmond agreed instantly. Quitting was easy for him. He'd done it 100 times before. Soon after, a new fight was brewing. Muhammad Ali publicly challenged George and was confident he'd win. Meanwhile, George's marriage was falling apart. They had kids, but Paula knew about the cheating, and it broke her heart. The fight with Muhammad Ali was held in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the climate was extremely hot and humid, something both boxers weren't used to. When George arrived, Ali was already the center of media attention, but George didn't take the bait. He simply gave Ali a fierce stare and walked away. In the ring, Ali mostly stayed on defense, leaning against the ropes and letting George wear himself out, throwing punches. Ali blocked most of the blows with his arms, waiting for George to get exhausted in the sweltering heat. And when George finally tired out, Ali went on the offensive. In the end, Ali won the match. George returned home defeated, and his life began to fall apart. To earn back the public's respect, George arranged a series of fights against multiple opponents, with Muhammad Ali even present. But George failed to impress him. After one match, George was told that his sister had gone into labor with serious complications, and the baby might not survive. He offered to pay for the best doctors, but it wouldn't solve the issue. Desperate, George turned to prayer, even though he hadn't spoken to God in a long time. Miraculously, both the baby and his sister pulled through. George saw it as a sign. Not long after, George had another match and lost again. In the locker room, he collapsed and briefly lost consciousness. When he came to, he had a revelation. He would devote his life to God. George left boxing, became a born-again Christian, and started preaching. The church became his new home. But Doc Broadus couldn't accept the new George and still hoped he'd return to the ring. George realized he had to make amends. He visited Muhammad Ali to ask forgiveness for his hatred and for wanting to hurt him in the ring. Ali forgave him, and the two even became friends. Then George went to Paula, now living separately, and apologized for the pain he had caused her. Later, George met Mary Joan Martelli at church. He noticed her during one of his sermons. Mary had always known George as a man of brute strength, not spirituality. But one day she saw him preaching on the street, calmly enduring mockery and insults without a hint of anger. That's when she realized he had truly changed and decided to give him a chance. They started dating and soon built a real family together. George bought an abandoned building and turned it into a church. He preached there, sharing the word of God with his community. One day, a woman approached him, asking for help with her son, who had started down a dangerous path. She wanted George to train him in boxing, but George refused. He was done with that world. Sometime later, George saw a news report on TV. That same boy had gotten involved in crime and ended up in serious trouble. It hit George hard. He realized he had a responsibility to the youth in his community. So he opened a sports center where kids could learn boxing, basketball, and other sports. A safe place to grow, stay off the streets, and believe in themselves. The youth center was running well until George ran out of money. The power was shut off due to unpaid bills, and a visit to the bank confirmed it. He was bankrupt. If he didn't find a way to earn money fast, the center would be shut down. Around the same time, Desmond vanished. That's when George realized the harsh truth. His old friend, who loved to drink, had never truly handled his finances. Instead, he tried to make ends meet by doing commercials, signing autographs, and selling his belongings. But even that wasn't enough to cover the debts. That's when George remembered his past and turned to Doc Broadus. He asked him to train him again, even if it meant starting from the bottom. Doc agreed, but only on one condition. George had to lose weight. George trained seriously, running, eating oatmeal for breakfast, carrying a calf on his shoulders, and pulling a car. Once he hit the target weight, he returned to Doc, and the serious training began. Still, despite all the effort, George wasn't yet in perfect shape. Meanwhile, Mary had a dream. In it, George won a fight and became champion. She saw it as a sign from God, or a divine message, and believed George was meant to glorify the Lord through his next fight. He started small. In 1987, George fought Steve Zilski and won. At first, the crowd laughed at the aging boxer, but soon they began to cheer. After another match with a professional fighter, George earned a big payday. Though he lost to Evander Holyfield, a much younger opponent, it didn't matter. The money was enough to pay off his debts and stabilize his finances. The church and youth center were saved. A huge part of George's financial comeback came from his grill endorsement. Sales soared. He could have stopped there. He had already achieved his goal. Mary advised him to retire, but George felt something was still ahead. He couldn't forget Mary's dream, where he became champion and honored God. George believed this was his calling, and if he didn't try, he'd regret it forever. Then came the fight with Michael Moorer, the reigning heavyweight champion. No one believed that a 45-year-old could stand a chance against such a young, strong opponent. But George shocked the world. He won. His trainer and Mary were overjoyed. After the match, George dropped to his knees and began to pray. Until that moment, Doc believed George only won fights through anger and aggression. He had even urged him to bring back that fire. But George refused. He remained compassionate and kind, even in the ring. And in the end, Doc realized that was the right path all along. At 45 years old, 20 years after losing the title, George Foreman became the heavyweight champion of the world once again. He remained close friends with Muhammad Ali, and they talked on the phone almost every day. George had 5 sons and named them all George. He even joked about it on a talk show. He also has a daughter named Georgetta. Today, George still preaches at his church and runs the Youth Sports Center. And in 1998, Doc Broadus was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. George Foreman was a legendary boxer and a man of great faith and heart. He passed away on March 21, 2025, at the age of 76. His story and legacy will never be forgotten.